Okay, so in today's video notes, we are going to be talking about how matter cycles. And so we will be covering chapter 3, section 4. And our essential question is, can you describe how matter moves through the biosphere? So before we begin, we have to talk about what this matter is. And so it's these 6 molecules that are essential for all living things to work and function. And so we're going to go through these 6 molecules. The first one is carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So these 6 molecules are very important to life. And to help us remember, we come up with this fun word called CHNOPS. And so the CHNOPS molecules are referring to all 6 of these. And now these molecules help build other molecules that we need. So like water, carbohydrates, fats, nucleic acids, and proteins are all molecules that these help form. And so those are really essential for all life. And so how do these essential elements, these carbons, these nitrogens, where do they come from, and how often are they available in our ecosystem? Well, before we talk about that, I need to explain the difference between energy and matter. So energy, like we said, that happens in trophic levels in food webs and food chains, energy actually flows in one direction. It is a flow. And once it's used, it's gone. It's all used up. Can't come back. Now matter, for example, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, those matter is what we call recyclable or cycles, and so it can be cycled over and over again. So I have this picture here showing you the water flowing in one direction. That represents energy, and once it's used, it's gone. It can't come back. But matter, the carbon, the nitrogen, those kinds of things, those can recycle and be used over and over and over and over again. And so I want you to think of that matter as something that can never be created or destroyed. The carbon, the nitrogen, you can't create nitrogen. You can't destroy carbon. It's always been there. Whatever carbon started, the carbon's still there. It's just what can happen is it can change and transform into different types of matter. And so that's why we can recycle, is because it's just transforming and changing. Okay, so when we're looking at matter cycling and how matter cycles, we are referring to something called biogeochemical cycles, which are different processes of how matter cycles through our biosphere. And so we'll be looking at biological for the bio, geological for the geo, and chemical physical for the chemical piece. So when we're referring to bio in the biogeochemical, we're referring to life, bio meaning life, so the biological processes. So living organisms can transform and rearrange matter, and they can affect how that matter cycles. And so examples would be breathing. For example, we breathe out CO2. That carbon is in a carbon gas form. Or we can eliminate waste, like nitrogen can be in our waste products, and that nitrogen get back into the soil. So those are all life processes, biological processes. Now when referring to geo, we're referring to the geological, which is like the earth processes. So we can rearrange and change matter through earth processes. So volcanic activity can change and rearrange matter. Reforming and breaking rock can rearrange and change. For example, coal and limestone can rearrange carbon molecule atoms. And then also earthquakes, movements of the earth's surface and things like that can also rearrange and change matter. The chemical part of biogeochemical is referring to both chemical, and it's also referring to the physical. And so you can, with water, water is a cycle, and you've probably learned about it in middle school, but water is made of hydrogens and oxygens, and water can change forms and rearrange. And so clouds and precipitation can help with that. Lightning is also can help with rearranging and changing nitrogen, for example. So these are the chemical physical parts of the cycle that can rearrange and change matter. And then finally, there's not human in the word biogeochemical, but human activity can also affect how matter cycles through our biosphere. When we burn fossil fuels, that can release carbon. When we farm land and we tear down trees for buildings, that can also change matter. Burning forests can release carbon in the atmosphere. Fertilizers, using fertilizers in our farms, can add nutrients, can add nitrogen and phosphorus into the soil, which then can cycle more of that matter through the biosphere.
What is the importance of nutrient cycles? Well, nutrients are essential to carry out life processes. So during those biogeochemical cycles, nutrients are going to be changed, or we could say nutrients will be transformed. So the nutrients we're looking at are water, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and all those are needed for life processes. So first let's look at how nitrogen is cycling. So nitrogen gas is, most of the nitrogen is locked up in the atmosphere as gas. As you can see, 78% of our Earth's atmosphere is made up of nitrogen gas. Most people think it's oxygen. Well, we need that nitrogen from the air to come down to the ground so that living things can use it. So one thing that these living things need nitrogen for are DNA. Nitrogen is a component inside of all our cells within DNA molecules. So how is nitrogen changed? How is it transformed? So one way it's transformed is through nitrogen fixation. So this is a process in which nitrogen gas from the air is fixed into a form of nitrogen that organisms like you and me can use on land. So here's one way nitrogen can be fixed, which is by lightning. The lightning will break up nitrogen atoms that are in the atmosphere, and they mix with oxygen and they fall down to the earth and form different forms of nitrogen. Here's another way nitrogen can be fixed. So certain plants called legumes, which are like bean and pea plants, they have special bacteria that live on their roots. And these bacteria are specialized. They can take nitrogen gas from the air and they can fix it within the ground to a form of nitrogen that all living things can use. So if you think about this, this is how we can get our nitrogen. So once it's in the atmosphere, the beans can fix it under the ground, and therefore that nitrogen is fixed where we can eat the plant and therefore get the nitrogen. That's how we can get it into our DNA. The opposite of nitrogen fixation is denitrification. So this is where nitrogen from the soil or the land goes back up into the atmosphere. How this works is dead organisms and waste products have nitrogen within them, and that's contained within our soil. Different bacteria in the soil can convert that nitrogen back into the gas form, which is released back into the atmosphere.
You keep going.
All right, so in an ecosystem, we've got our nutrients such as nitrogen, and sometimes nitrogen and other nutrients can be in short supply. And so there's not always going to be enough nitrogen available for living organisms or other essential nutrients as well. So this picture shows an analogy of how plants can only produce enough biomass depending on the limiting nutrients. So even if you have a lot of heat and organic matter, nitrogen and potassium, plants are only going to do as well as the limited nutrient that's available for them, which in this case is phosphorus. So ecologists can study the ecosystem's primary productivity, which is the rate at which primary producers create organic material. So if we have an essential nutrient that plants need and it's in short supply, then we say that primary productivity is limited, so plants will not make enough food. And then a limiting nutrient are nutrients whose supply is decreasing productivity. An example in nutrient limitation is in farming. When we put our seeds into the ground to grow our food, the soil that we plant them in isn't going to have enough nutrients for the plants to grow and produce the food that we need. So we create fertilizers and we put them into the soil, and that's going to help the plant grow. Some things that can happen though when we add our nutrients to these farming ecosystems is that we can have excess fertilizer run off into the rivers and streams. So we add nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and other essential nutrients for plants, which helps the plants grow. But if all those nutrients aren't taken up by the plants, they'll run off into rivers and streams. And what can happen with that is if we get all this excess nutrients running off into the rivers and streams and then eventually the oceans, what will happen is algae will grow. And algae likes phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium, just like other plants do. And so what can happen is this runoff will create huge growths of algae, which is good for some cases, but when you get a algae growth that's overgrown, it can cause a lot of problems. So for instance, we're seeing this in the Gulf Coast right now, where we have a lot of nitrogen running off into the streams that eventually go into the Gulf, and then that causes algae to grow and bloom, and when it dies, it depletes the oxygen in the water, and so that prevents other organisms from growing. And this is a really good picture. So this is in the Gulf Coast, and you can see all this green here is algae bloom, and that's because all that nitrogen and all the other nutrients that we put into the soil in our farming ecosystems have run off into the ocean and have caused this algae bloom. And so when that algae dies and decays, it's going to deplete the oxygen in the water and preventing other things from growing and surviving. And we can see this too in our backyard ecosystems or in parks or anything that's close to a lawn that uses fertilizers. If we use too much fertilizer, it can run off into the streams and into our ponds and cause these huge algae blooms. And then the same thing happens. It's called eutrophication, when an algae bloom results from too much nutrient from sources such as phosphorus and nitrogen in fertilizers, and it causes oxygen to be depleted. Alright, so the questions you need to answer in your video notes form is, what is the difference between energy and matter in the biosphere? And then I need you to provide 2 examples of how nitrogen cycles through the biosphere. So make sure you fill that out in the Google form.